So the stage is yours. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And sorry about those technical difficulties. It always ironically happens at tech conferences that you can't get the technology to work. But I want to say a big thank you, obviously, for having me along. And I've got a hard act to follow with Sol. We were discussing last night. It does feel like we're also pitching against each other why our country is the best. And I think, obviously, that's not the right attitude. We should all cooperate and learn what's best. But obviously, UK is the best. So that just so that's clear. So I'm here to talk about the UK startup ecosystem and a bit about me to begin with. My background isn't in technology. I was originally in politics as a policy wonk in government, worked for various different bits of government, and now work in tech policy. So I'm running an organization called Coadec, which is the Coalition for the Digital Economy, which was set up by tech entrepreneurs to be the policy voice of startups. So much like Startup Poland is going to now be a sort of a great advocate for Polish startups to policymakers in government, Coadec is there in the UK fighting the battles with UK government and policymakers to try and improve life for startups. And last year, we joined the ranks of many countries who were writing their own startup manifestos. And so I wrote the UK's Startup Manifesto, which is available online if you want to have a look at it, but setting out some policy ideas for how the UK can be made even better when it comes to startups. Because broadly, my view is that things are really good in the UK. Someone last night I was talking to at dinner said, how can you possibly be advocating for sort of startup policies? The UK is like El Dorado for startups. And I think in many ways they're right, that there really is this great startup ecosystem. That's just some of the press we got around the manifesto launch, which I think demonstrates the sort of power you can have through organizations like Startup Poland, through Coadec, when sort of entrepreneurs get together and sort of campaign, you can really sort of shift the needle because, as Saul was saying in the last presentation, every politician wants to boost GDP, and the way you do that is through sort of innovative, high-growth companies. There are some great stats from Nesta and some other people recently showing that in the UK at least, just the top 6% of high-growth companies, so 6% of fast-growth companies, which tend to be startups, are the ones that delivered over half of the economic growth and over half of the net new jobs. So it's really these sorts of companies where the jobs and the growth are going to come from in the future, and that's why I think it's quite easy for us all to knock on the door of politicians and say, listen to us, this is what we need, this is how you can make life better. As you'll have noticed, I see most of these things through a political lens, and I think throughout this talk I'm going to try and emphasize how politics and policy matters. But just going back, I was saying that life is good for a UK entrepreneur, startups are thriving. And just last week, it was London Technology Week, and we had some new data out from GP Bullhound, which I'm sure many of you will have seen about the sort of the state of the European unicorn, these sort of mythical beasts that are valued at over $1 billion. And it found that there were actually 40 unicorns across Europe, 13 of them new this year, and of those, 17 are from the UK. So I can sort of proudly stand here as a sort of representative from the UK and say, sort of, we seem to be doing something right and have got some great companies coming through. There's lots of household names coming out of the UK. I'm sure some of them you'll have heard of, maybe think companies like TransferWise, which are sort of recently raised a round of funding from Andreessen Horowitz, valued at $1 billion. Some great companies across fintech, the sharing economy, mobile, edtech, mainly consumer-facing, but lots of good startups nonetheless. And so why is this? I'm not an academic, and I think Saul had a great sort of typology for why. There are many ways you can cut it, but I quite like Up Global. They did a white paper last year on startup ecosystems and what makes them successful, and I quite like the way they structured it: talent, density, culture, capital, and the regulatory environment. And so many people might look at that and think, actually, well, those are all important, and the only one that government really matters to is the last one, it's regulatory environment, and maybe talent. But actually my argument, I think, is that government and policy making and sort of political decisions and leadership actually cut across all of these and matter to all of these. So just going to go through these. Oh, actually first, so politics matters, and the UK example, We've got two of the most powerful, influential politicians in the UK. George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, back in 2012, gave a speech at the launch of Google Campus in London. I know you're going to be having your very own Google Campus here in a few months' time. But there he set the ambition for the UK. We want nothing less than to make the UK the technology centre of Europe. And this wasn't just a flash in the pan. Too often with politicians, they make a big announcement, make a speech, and then it disappears. You don't hear about it ever again from them. But in the UK, there has been a quite consistent political commitment to startups and tech. And we had our elections just a few weeks ago in May. And on the campaign trail, Prime Minister David Cameron said again that he wanted this to be the startup nation of Europe and one of the great startup nations of the world. And throughout the last 5 years of them in government and even before, there has really been this political commitment and engagement that makes a real difference. So going through those 5 up global elements, talent, I think the UK succeeds because it has incredibly talented population. We've got world-class universities, universities like Cambridge, where there's a big tech cluster, great companies like DeepMind, SwiftKey came out of the Cambridge cluster, as well as older, more proper deep physical tech hardware companies like ARM, the big chip manufacturer, Raspberry Pi. We've got fantastic university cluster in London with UCL, Imperial, King's, and we've also got that relatively new phenomenon of these training programs, people like Makers Academy, General Assembly, coding boot camps. There are now places you can go and over a 12-week program learn web development or learn to be a back-end developer. And that's a relatively new phenomenon, but seems to be working quite well as people are trying to shift into this area where there's huge demand for skills. Because there are I think, estimates that we need 1 million new digital trained people in the next decade in the UK alone. And how are you going to get them? One of the ways you're going to get them is that last point, coding on the curriculum. So the UK is it's doing a bit of an experiment, really. It's one of the first countries in the world to do this. And as of last September, there's proper computing on the curriculum in schools. So we all had a bit of a screw up in the 90s when Microsoft set the agenda for IT in schools, and IT lessons were basically just learning to use Microsoft Office. And that may have been all very well and meant that we could use Excel properly, but it means that we lost the proper computer science that you had coming out of schools in the 70s and 80s when things like the BBC Micro and children were really being taught actually how to code. So I think it's brilliant that now children from as young as 5 throughout the school are going to be learning proper computational thinking, what an algorithm is, and yes, coding too. Finally on talent, there's a stat that surprised me and stuck out, so I included it, that someone did a survey recently looking at Stack Overflow, the developers' Q&A website, at where actually the high densities of talent were, where the top-rated developers were. And they found that actually if you look at developers with a rating on the site of over 5,000, and I'm not a developer, but I'm told that this is like a very impressive elite Uber rating, that actually the city with the most people with that ratings over 5,000 was actually not San Francisco or New York, it was London, just to show that the talent that is there. Next, density. So there are hundreds of thousands of workers in the London tech sector, more across the country. There have been identified at least 21 different tech clusters around the UK, each of which specialize in slightly different things. And equally, there are at least 59 accelerators and incubators. So there really is this density of talent, and it's not just London. As I said, there was this great report out recently called Tech Nation, which drew on some really cool data to find out where all these digital companies were, and actually found that 74% of the UK's digital companies aren't even in London, and that you get these great other clusters, some of which you wouldn't quite expect, but they're there nonetheless. So Dundee, for example, up in Scotland, has a great video gaming cluster as a result of having a great university there, which is the best place to go in the country for video games. And that's why GTA 5 and Rockstar North are based there, making fantastic hits, like GTA. So culture. think that's another really important element of any ecosystem, that you have role models, that entrepreneurship is celebrated. Here we've got sort of 21 faces. I just picked those out because they are, the FT recently did the 50 best entrepreneurs in Europe, and these are the 21 from the UK they chose, and it's, I think, firstly, great that the UK had 21 out of the 50 in Europe, but more that sort of you've got media, politics, we've got all sorts of sectors now embracing entrepreneurship and championing entrepreneurship, and that these guys are becoming sort of role models and mentors and aspirant sort of characters in the community. You've got the sort of the meetups, the drinks, the conferences. Every night there is sort of there are more startup events in London than you could possibly ever go to in a lifetime. And you've got some great community organizations like Three Beards, who organize Silicon Drinkabout, which is on the sort of more fun side, where every Friday night they take over a bar somewhere, and anyone who's wanting to get into startups or learn about it can just go along. Finally, I talked a lot about politics. I think political leadership here matters too to the culture. Last week, you had startups going into Buckingham Palace, the sort of the heart of the British establishment, for a pitching contest called Pitch at the Palace, which the Duke of York organises. We've had Pitch 10, which is startups going into Downing Street to do pitching competitions. You've had the Prime Minister taking startups with him on trade missions to New York. He took a group of cybersecurity startups to New York, and he also took some startups a few years ago with him on a trip to China. So the fact that you've got these sort of insurgent, rebel, outsider companies, these sort of startups with this sort of messy entrepreneurship, getting into the heart of the British establishment, which is a sort of notoriously difficult nut to crack, I think is a sign of how culture has shifted, and in a very positive way, that now 30% of Cambridge computer science graduates are applying to Entrepreneur First, which is a great sort of pre-accelerator program. In the past, they may well have gone into industry or academia, but now they want to become entrepreneurs. And I think we're seeing stats like this in other countries and other universities around the world, but it does speak to the importance of culture. Capital is vital, and we spoke a lot about that in the last session. And sort of VC is on the rise. The latest stats from the UK show that there was $780 million invested in UK tech companies in the first quarter of this year, which is a new record. And on my next slide, I've got the graph showing it, and it sort of is quite an impressive rise. This has been driven partly by US investors coming over. So Google Ventures set up their European HQ in London last year. Andreessen Horowitz has started making European investments, including 2 in London, in TransferWise, and in Probable. Crowdfunding is also taking off. On the right here, we've got a chart showing equity crowdfunding, and which went from nothing, sort of peanuts, £4 million back in 2012, to last year, 84 million, and I think the stats for next year are going to be sort of even bigger. And this, I think, again, goes back to the politics and policy point, because this was driven partly, I think, because the UK took an early decision to engage with nascent platforms like Seedrs and Crowdcube, who were basically calling out, please regulate us, please create a framework in which we can operate with proper financial regulation, because no one's going to trust us if we don't have that stamp of approval. So it was the rare case of the entrepreneur going to the regulator saying, please regulate us more, rather than the other way around, as it usually is. But there was this sort of policy decision to engage with fintech and engage with alternative finance, and I think that's now paying off, as these stats show. Finally, on the policy side, there are some really generous incentives around angel investment. So EIS and SEIS are 2 schemes that essentially give really generous tax breaks if you put in money as an angel to a startup. So through SEIS, the seed version, the Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme, a company can raise up to £150,000, which isn't a huge amount, but it's a decent seed round. But for the investor, you get upfront 50% tax relief. So you put in £100,000, you can offset 50% of that against your tax immediately. If it goes well, if the company succeeds and you make a lot of money, you don't have to pay capital gains tax. So your upside is protected. And if it fails and just flops entirely, you've already had 50% of your investment de-risks, but you can offset some of the loss as well against future taxes. So you get some loss relief. So it is a very, very generous tax relief, which some say has led to dumb money flowing in and led to overly ambitious valuations, and I'm sure there's some truth to that. But I think the net, it is positive because it has led to new waves of people becoming angels, sort of city bankers who wouldn't otherwise have thought that this was an asset class they wanted to get into, are becoming angel investors, and that's really increasing the sort of the bottom of the pyramid, the amount of money going in, which in turn I think will help incentivize the later stage, the sort of VCs and growth funding later. So here's that chart I promised about funding on the rise, and I think it is a very impressive sort of rise. Just in Q1, say 2015, 781 million. Of that, 600 and something, I forget, was in London, and that's 7 times. So it was $640 million invested in London in the first quarter of this year. In the whole of 2010, $100 million was invested. So it's up nearly 6 or 7 times on the entire year of 2010 in the first quarter of this year. So some might say this is pointing to a bubble. I disagree, but I think it's showing just a healthy ecosystem that's getting now much more investment. The final point was about the regulatory environment, and as I've already said, there's been significant engagement right from the top of government, so that's why I've got a nice picture of Downing Street there, because you've got entrepreneurs going in almost every week, every month. There are these tech city breakfasts with the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's advisors. He held one last week where he and the Chancellor of the Exchequer met a load of digital entrepreneurs and basically said, we're going to keep listening to you, we're going to keep trying to make things better, and that, I think, makes a huge difference. And in terms of tangible policy change, we've seen things like a review into the sharing economy. So this was one of the things I called for in our startup manifesto. I said, the UK has lots of really good sharing economy startups. Let's have a review into the regulation surrounding that so that we can look to help that grow and also make sure consumers are protected and we've got the right rules in place. And that then happened. We had a fantastic review. The government responded to it very positively. And the government's now even doing things like looking at how government assets, government office space, government car journeys can be put onto sharing platforms where the civil servants, when they're traveling overseas, rather than booking very expensive hotels, can start staying in Airbnbs or using Ubers. So I think that's sort of a cultural shift even within government that we're seeing. Finally, final example is about financial regulation. So London has a great history of being a sort of financial hub, the City of London, but also because of the technical talent now available, fintech is really booming as a sector, and so there's been a political push to engage with fintech and make sure the regulations are sort of not blocking out these new entrants who are challenging the incumbents. So the financial regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, set up something called the Innovation Hub and Project Innovate. And while these are not very impressive civil servant-y type titles, they have led to sort of proper engagement. So you've got things like the Treasury doing a study into digital currencies, trying to grapple with how they should engage with Bitcoin, the blockchain. You've got new banking licenses being granted with easier conditions so that banking startups like Getmondo and Starling can try and get off the ground with the sort of digital-first, mobile-first banking. And I think that's a really positive trend. So there are still some challenges. I'd say one of the big challenges, not just in the UK but across Europe, is scaling up. How do you go from the sort of the billion-dollar company to the 10 billion, 100 billion, and so this was a chart also from that Unicorn report showing that the cumulative value of European startups was 120 billion, which sort of pales in comparison just to sort of 1 or 2 of the big US tech companies. And so I think scaling up is definitely still something we need to work at. And I think projects like the European Digital Single Market can help with that, but it's also going to be a generational thing. As we get more exits, as we get more capital, we'll be able to scale up quicker within our own continent. I think diversity is still a challenge, less so on sort of ethnic and racial grounds in the UK, because it's a very diverse place, especially in London, but particularly on gender, there's a huge women in tech problem, and I think that's a real issue that needs to be dealt with right down the kind of chain back to schools and education, because not enough girls are studying computer science and engineering and STEM subjects. And there are still some policy challenges. I'm really worried about some of the rhetoric around immigration coming out of the current government in the UK. I'm also worried by the possibility of leaving the EU and what that could mean for the UK's ecosystem. So I think there are some still big policy challenges remaining. But by and large, as I hope you've realised, I'm an optimist. I'm a big evangelist for sort of the UK and for London. Yeah, that's all from me. But do stay in touch. Those are my Twitter stuff. And thank you.
Thank you.